Hello, everyone. I'm excited to be interviewing one of the poetry editors from one of my favorite feminist lit mags, Literary Mama. Ellen Elder was born in New York City, raised in Cincinnati, and educated at the University of Chicago, Miami University of Ohio, and the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee. She spent childhood summers in Ireland, where her family ran an inn. Her poetry has been nominated for a Pushcart Prize and has appeared in About Place Journal, Banshee Lit, Bird's Thumb, DMQ Review, Tampa Review, and elsewhere. She is co-poetry editor at Literary Mama and most recently taught at Heinrich Heine University in Dusseldorf, Germany, where she lived with her daughter until 2021. She now lives in Charleston, South Carolina. Welcome, Ellen, and thanks so much for taking some time to chat with me for the Telltale Poetry Submission interview series.
Well, thank you, Trish, for this interview for Literary Mama, and thanks to Telltale Poetry for the opportunity.
Yes, these interviews have been just so much fun for me, and I'm really excited to have you here today. So, how did you become one of the poetry editors for Literary Mama?
Well, I saw that Literary Mama was interviewing for a co-poetry editor in October 2020, the first fall of the pandemic. I was living in Germany, and the poet Alison Blevins was the other co-poetry editor at the time. She's since moved to a directorial position at another press. They interviewed me extensively, and when they offered me the position, I was thrilled to accept. The esteemed poet Libby Maxey, who had been and still is a senior editor at Literary Mama, graciously stepped up to also act as co-poetry editor when Alison stepped down. Libby and I have been working together for about a year, and she comes from a classics background, where I come from a creative writing background. So I think we bring to Literary Mama a nice mix of both the classic and the contemporary, with a big dose of feminist poetics.
Excellent. I love that. I certainly enjoy the poetry that is published in Literary Mama. So it's exciting to have feminist editors. How can our listeners find editing opportunities like this?
Yeah. Well, first, in order to find open editing opportunities, one must read and support the literary magazines. And once you read and support them, you inevitably hear about the openings. Also, and this is one thing I didn't know before beginning at Literary Mama, I'd only worked as a grad student on Cream City Review at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee before this. But so one thing I didn't know about it is how detailed the many tasks are that make up putting together a successful journal. And also how many roles people play and how those roles need to be clearly defined and delineated. For example, at Literary Mama, we have 24 editors. 8 are senior and 16 are staff. Yeah, so it's really versatile. And that this is good news, though. So because depending upon one's interest, there's a chance if you look that you'll find an opening somewhere. And maybe if it's not in the first sort of editing choice you had, it still might be in some other capacity that can serve the journal as a whole. And also, what's also surprising to me is that there doesn't seem to be a lot of turnover working at these journals. Even though most of us work as volunteers, I think that editing work is so intrinsically rewarding. I think it's perhaps because writers thrive working with other writers that we end up staying in our positions, even if it might not be that staff position that you first wanted. And then if editors leave, it seems that the only reason they leave is just to take another position at another journal, and then therefore that leaves that position open. And so to promote Literary Mama a little bit, right now we are looking for a photo editor, the last I knew, and we also need photography contributions.
Excellent, excellent. Now that's really exciting to hear about how that works. And I will tell you, having been a reader for some lit mags in the past, like there is something really, really exciting about coming across, that next piece of work that you really want to publish. So, I mean, I know, working, it doesn't sound as exciting as it feels when you're doing it. Yeah. It is very rewarding. So I appreciate you sharing that with the listeners. So, we talked a little bit about the behind the scenes, but how does Literary Mama manage all the submissions and what does that selection process look like?
Yeah, we're getting a lot of poetry submissions right now, which is exciting. We love that. We accept them all year, which is not always the norm for literary journals. We allow writing mamas to
Mhm.
submit year round, I think because it caters to literary mamas, their busy lives, especially moms or those who identify as moms who are momming and writing and working all at once. And as writers, when you move to submit a new piece and you see that the submission window is closed or that the journal only accepts submissions for a certain narrow window of time, it's kind of a letdown. So I think with Literary Mama accepting year round, we end up rewarding writers and encouraging them to submit whenever they can. We ask for 3 poems at a time, or up to 3 poems, in the body of the email, so not as an attachment. If they're sent as an attachment, I'll simply kindly send the submission guidelines back and ask them to resubmit. If a poet sometimes sends too many poems, they don't often. I'll just read the first 3 poems. So it's 3 poems in the body of the email. And a short bio is always appreciated. As 2 co-poetry editors, we then divide the submissions. So Libby and I will read our poems carefully and then set aside any or read many that we want to discuss for possible publication. And we call these under reviews. So we have a system in place. We use a spreadsheet where we post and discuss the possible poems. We send many emails back and forth. It's a very lively process. Often there might be a poem that one of us wants to accept and the other might not be so keen on, but we always arrive at an agreement. We either win the other one over, who's less enthused, or we encourage that poet to submit again. Perhaps we just feel that poem is not ready or unfinished. So then with the dozen or so poems that we agree on in that reading cycle, and a reading cycle could be every month or every 3 months, we send those to the senior editors on duty to weigh in on. So they do get an opinion. And if they have editing suggestions, and a lot of times one of us or one of the senior editors will have a suggestion, we'll correspond individually with that poet to suggest those edits. Although this part can be time consuming, but it's always rewarding. I myself always respected when editors had suggestions for one of my poems, a new title, moving a stanza, cutting lines, tightening an ending. It's as if it showed that they cared. And so that's a nice process, a nice back and forth. And so then we, once we have the go, then we send the acceptances and work out the contracts and then decide which issue the poems go into.
Excellent, excellent. I think it really is helpful for people to hear about everything that's happening behind the scenes to really put out, the great next issue. So
Yeah.
I love that Literary Mama is open year round for submissions. And I know you also take fiction and creative nonfiction and poetry. You mentioned that you're looking for photography, but what do you wish you'd see submitted that rarely comes in?
For poems, we like what we're getting. We're always hoping for a most diverse range of submissions. So we are looking for more submissions from non-binary, LGBTQ plus, and BIPOC writers, for example. We want more poems from poets who identify as fathers. We are inclusive. Our only stipulation is that the poem is, well, it knocks us off our feet or it tugs at our hearts, but that the poem is somehow about mothering or that idea of the mother, the mothering experience, whether as parent or child, whether the writer identifies as a traditional cisgendered mom or not, or is writing about what might be considered sort of normative mothering issues or not. We have seen an uptick in more experimentally voiced poems that dare to look at and reveal and question these assumptions and expectations about motherhood and mothering in new ways. And for that, we're really pleasantly surprised. But we do hope to see more so in our journal. So our journal could continue to be expansive in voice and inclusive in representation.
Excellent, excellent.
And
So
in that vein too, if readers have questions, I would
no, you're
encourage them
good.
to check out our website, literarymama.com, and check out the statement on diversity, equity, and inclusion. So
Yes, absolutely. That's great when journals have that type of information right there where it's available for folks who are checking them out to look at and understand the approach of the
exactly.
literary magazine or journal. So that's excellent. Thanks for sharing that.
And there's
So
also a statement there. Sorry, there's also a statement
that's great.
about the concept of literary mama there as well. If I didn't explain it in full.
Excellent.
Yeah.
Excellent. So what do you enjoy most about being a poetry editor?
Um, that's sort of a easy question. I think I enjoy most reading poems. I've been writing poems since high school, so it's like more than 30 years, and I still find it difficult. So I find inspiration personally in reading so many different poems to see how someone still crafts a poem, how they begin it, how they title it, how to shape it, how to end it, what they include and what they don't include. That never gets old. What I like about being a poetry editor at Literary Mama is I like reading poems that feel as if they were recently written, as if they were urgently written, not as if they were penned ages ago in some writing workshop in grad school. I've, in a way, our journal is prompt driven because it's about this idea of motherhood and mothering. So the poems are all addressing something similar, yet in different ways. So the whole experience of reading the poems is sort of meta. What I like about reading these urgent poems is that they feel purposefully written. So I'm into my second year at Literary Mama, and I sense that many of these poems were written as if in response to some lived experience that the readers at the Literary Mamas needed to tell or wanted to try to tell. Like, no, this is what mothering is like, or no, this is how I think of a mother, or no, this is the sensation of nurturing, or no, this is the worst in motherhood, or no, this is the best in motherhood. So again, motherhood might be one of the most difficult concepts to capture. I didn't think of this before beginning editing at Literary Mama, but I think it's one of the most difficult concepts to capture in words because it depends on a writer's perspective, and because the idea of motherhood and mothering is so universal and so vast and so timeless. So in the end, it's really a joy to see the varied richness in all the different poets' approach. From writers writing all over the world in English. We get more and more international submissions, which is awesome.
That is definitely awesome. That certainly expands on the diversity of voices, right?
Mhm.
Because there is a certain culture that follows mothering as well from different country to country. So yeah, no, that's really exciting. So you talked a little bit about it, but what else do you look for in a poem that you would publish?
So I'm speaking for myself. My co-poetry editor might have a different view, but first I look for poems with a voice that, as if it really wants to be shaped as a poem. A voice is an abstract term in poetry, but it brings me back to that idea of purpose. After reading a poem in our journal, you might be moved to realize that, oh, that couldn't have been a painting, although I like to think of poems as paintings, but or oh, that poem couldn't have been a short story. That poem couldn't have been an essay. It had to be a poem. So visually, I also think poems are stunning. So I look for that when I hear the voice. I look at the way it looks on the page, on the screen, and usually I sense I like a poem that fits on one page, although I say I am one who tends to write narrative poems that go into the second page. So I listen for that voice, and in that sense, many times I might read it aloud. Second, I listen for lyric, some lyrical phrase or line that sort of sings a deeper feeling. Or maybe it's a line that echoes with irony or some sort of nuanced meaning. My definition of lyric is deep. By lyrical, I don't mean like pastel butterflies and painterly beauty, but I think of darkness, I think of strangeness. For me, a good poem that has a distinct lyrical voice is one where the language is almost organic, whether through word choice or syntax. For me, a good lyrical poem sort of coheres from start to finish. There's a flow, whatever that means. And there's a line or a phrase that maybe almost echoes like a song. Um, but that said, how do you define a good poem? I'm also a sucker for effective line breaks. In a good line break, you can often hear before you see it. In fact, you could argue that a line break where the line doesn't end stop with punctuation or extend to the end of the page, but it breaks and it jams to the next line. You could argue that a line break isn't really a break, but it's its own ending. It's that important. I think it's the poet James Lagenbach who believes that we should not call them line breaks, but we should call them line endings. And this
Oh,
argument of his, I think, yeah, I love that. So he doesn't think they should be called line breaks, but line endings, because it is essentially an ending. And this argument of his, I think, only heightens the importance of those moments in the poem. And finally, personally, I don't really like predictable poems or poems where you know what the ending is, or it's all revealed. It's too perfect, the closure. And I respect a poem that surprises and that questions, that risks a line break to do something odd, or that turns like a sonnet does, and it ends with or changes perspective, or it ends with a distinctive closure. Or sorry, that ends without a distinctive closure, that sort of opens it up to something new. And I think those are the poems that understand themselves as a work of art, that have the reader in mind, and they allow the reader to participate more in the poem. The reader participates in that sort of unfolding of meaning. And those, I think, are the poems that we want to reread. Sometimes they tend to be more difficult or confusing. We want to reread them a little bit, and we realize that those might be the ones that readers connect to. So,
yes, I definitely, from my perspective, a poem where, I can read it over and over and still find a new connection or something else
right,
interesting that I didn't see before. Like you said, a
right,
surprise and
yeah,
line endings. I'm going to say line endings from now on. It's so much better
yeah,
than line break.
yeah.
So
I've been thinking about that more and more. Yeah,
yeah, I
and in that,
really love that.
yeah, and in that sense, the poem sort of is like a painting. So you stand before it, for a while, and you sort of let it sort of take on its own meanings. That,
Yes,
that,
absolutely.
that,
Love that very much. So, what would you like to see more of in the literary community?
um, I think I'd like to see just more poetry, more
Mm,
reading and writing events for women and children. I feel for non-binaries in places where we can all connect in a safe artistic place, sort of as a community. These places exist, but I feel like there aren't as many of them, or they're not very well known. Um, or you have to dig for them. I've only been in Charleston
mm,
for a year, and so it has taken me for a while to find places. And here in Charleston, in South Carolina, for example, there's a poet laureate position. They're actually accepting applications right now for a new one. The former one, who did a phenomenal job, 6 years I think, is just now
wow.
stepping down. Yeah, and when I researched the position and I found that it wasn't compensated, not that they often are, and I had this like sense of scary disappointment, like for the future of poets. I thought, here
Mm,
is yet another chance where it could just be a real job, and it makes it feel like not a real job if there's a poet laureate and there's no compensation. Um, so I think it's sort of a dream, but what I'd like to see more of in the literary community is sort of acknowledgments of the importance of writers and what writers can do and what writers do accomplish. My hope is that like sort of city and state officials would work more closely with school boards and work more closely with foundations just to find the means to fund positions like the poet laureate. Because poet laureates, for example, are instrumental in connecting poetry to the neighborhoods. And they start with kids at school usually. And then, it's nice to sort of think that the kids right now, I mean, those are our future poets. Um, and it would be sort of a dream to have two poet laureates in a city. I was thinking a senior and a vice poet laureate. And then one could work with the schools and the one could work with the community at large. But again, it comes down to what our society values. And, it seems to be other things besides poems right now. But yeah,
yes, definitely. No, that would be great. I personally would love to see a poet laureate in every town and city.
I know.
I
Can you
think that would
imagine?
be fantastic.
Even
And
the
to have
small
it
towns. Yeah.
exactly. I live in a small town in Colorado, and that
Yeah.
would be
Yeah.
it would be awesome. We do have a pretty strong writing community here, and I am seeing a lot of
Right.
the writers really step up and sort of take those roles. But if they could be funded, that would that would certainly help add importance, and it would
Mhm.
help the rest of the community sort of understand how much their contributions do make a difference. So
Yeah.
no,
And it
I'm
would be a symbolic. I think it would be a nice symbolic
exactly.
acknowledgement too. I really think so. But uh,
I agree. I agree.
uh,
So speaking of writing, what are you currently working on with your own writing?
thank you for asking. So I write about mothers and motherhood. from the framework of sort of at home and abroad, having lived in a few countries now. My debut poetry collection is called Mother Float, and it has now been a finalist 3 times at least, and not yet published, so my fingers are eternally crossed. It's about a mother who abandoned her daughter when she was a toddler, leaving the father to raise the child. But it's not that narrative. And of course, that child was me. But I try to think of myself as separate from the poem's speakers. And many of the poems take place in Ireland. And the poems in my new manuscript center around, again, a single mom in Germany who has escaped a difficult, dangerous relationship. And I have added more humor, and of course the mom is like me. I have added more humor and irony to this collection. Just I think as poetry was a means of survival. So we had to survive that. Plus we had lockdown after lockdown in Germany during the pandemic. So as a single mom, I found myself I felt more and more as an artist in my house because I was trying to create this safe, positive, light, and happy environment for my daughter in order to shield her from, in part, and also sort of explain to her, in part, the realities of what was happening, what had happened in our own small lives, and what was happening in the greater world. Thankfully, at that point, I was only working half-time and teaching, so I could Zoom at the university from home, poetry workshops. So I had time to create the space for her. But ironically, because I was only working part-time, it was harder to survive economically. So that's the bulk of the book. We were existing on the border of 2 languages, so that plays in with it as well. So with these new poems, I'm hoping that they might empower, sort of become an empowering blend of the tough and the vulnerable in this sort of domestic space between home and abroad. And the working title is Late Light.
Oh, that sounds lovely.
You're the first person I've told that to.
Oh, well, that's very exciting. Well, now you've told a lot of people.
Yeah.
But no,
I
that is
know.
very exciting.
I'm like, I'm not sure, but it's a working title. I don't know if that would stick. I write book reviews too, and I have one coming out on the poet Chloe Honem's new collection, The Lantern Room, and her mom poems are great. That's coming out this summer. And so with all of us who do poetry on the side, and I know, Trish, that you do poetry a lot, both poetry too, that it keeps us pretty busy.
Yes, it does. Yeah, certainly. Especially with, we do, a lot of us have careers and other things that we're managing or mothering in so many different ways. So I think that's why, a journal like Literary Mama is so important, and really that approach of just always being open and supporting the literary mamas that are contributors. Really, really great work that you do. So how can our listeners sign up to get updates from Literary Mama?
Well, we have a newsletter, so you can go to the website, literarymama.com, and subscribe for our newsletter. We're also on social media. We have active Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter accounts. We're also on LinkedIn. We have a great, expansive website. And just as a reminder, on the website too, we do, that's where you can submit the poems, and you can also submit creative nonfiction, fiction, literary reflections, profiles, and book reviews. So we're looking for lots of submissions.
Excellent, excellent. Book reviews are so important too. I'm so glad that you mentioned those, because it's really, it's so much great support for your peers, but also I usually learn so much really digging in and reading a collection at that level of detail. It's just a different experience. So I love that you mentioned book reviews.
Yeah, that's really a good way to put it. They feel very different in some ways, but it is a necessary, I think, part of the process of writing. Absolutely. Poetry is also to practice writing about someone else's collection. Yeah.
100% agree. Well, thank you again for taking some time. This was such a great conversation. Yeah. And best of luck with both of your collections. That's so exciting. And please tell the rest of the editors at Literary Mama we appreciate what they do.
Yeah. And we're 20 years. I meant to say that.
Oh, that's right.
Turned 20 this year. Yeah.
20 years. Yes, absolutely. Awesome. Congratulations to everyone at Literary Mama.
Yeah.
And thanks so much for being here.
Yeah, thank you, Trish. I really appreciate this opportunity. And it was fun answering your questions. Thank you.
It was fun having you. Have a good night.
You too. Thank you.
Bye.